You've been giving compliments the wrong way your entire life. Beautiful. You look amazing. You're so hot. They sound polite. They sound safe. But let me ask you something honestly. If she's already heard those same words 1,000 times from men she barely remembers, why would your version suddenly matter? It doesn't. And that realization alone changes everything, because real attraction doesn't begin where flattery lives. It begins where emotion is stirred, where something deeper is felt, mentally, emotionally, sometimes even physically in a way she can't quite explain. And that kind of response doesn't come from polished, predictable praise. It comes from something far more powerful, something that slips quietly past her defenses and stays with her long after the moment ends. This isn't about sweet talk, it's about influence. It's about understanding the psychology of connection in a way most people never even attempt. And in this conversation, I'm going to walk you through a different kind of compliment. The kind that doesn't just sound nice, but creates tension, curiosity, and emotional imprint. The kind that makes a woman pause, think, and feel something she wasn't expecting. Because those are the moments she remembers. I'm Mary Smith, host of the Mindful Senior Living YouTube channel. And today I want to talk to you not just about attraction, but about something much deeper. The human need to feel seen, understood, and emotionally stirred in a world where most interactions have become surface level and forgettable. And I want you to really think about this for a moment. How many times in your life have you said something kind, something respectful, something you thought would be appreciated, and yet it just didn't land the way you expected? Maybe she smiled politely. Maybe she said thank you, but something inside you knew. It didn't create that spark. It didn't create that pause. It didn't create that feeling you were hoping for. That's because most people don't fail due to lack of effort. They fail because they're playing on the surface of human emotion instead of going deeper into how connection actually works. Let me give you a simple example from real life. Imagine a woman who hears "you're beautiful" 10 times a week, from strangers, from acquaintances, from people online. Over time, her brain starts filtering it out. It becomes background noise, not because it's untrue, but because it lacks emotional novelty. There's no new meaning attached to it. And the human brain, especially when it comes to attraction, is wired to respond to novelty, to contrast, to emotional stimulation. Psychologists have studied this for years. There's something called hedonic adaptation, which simply means we become used to repeated stimuli. The more we hear something, the less impact it has. So when you repeat the same compliment she's heard countless times, you're not creating attraction. You're reinforcing familiarity. And familiarity without emotional depth rarely creates desire. So what's the shift? The shift is this. Instead of describing what she already knows about herself, you describe the experience of her. You describe the effect she has. You describe something she doesn't hear every day. For example, instead of saying "you're beautiful," you might say something like, "There's something about the way you look at people. It's a little dangerous." Now pause for a second and feel the difference. One is a label, the other is an experience. One is predictable, the other creates curiosity. And curiosity is one of the most powerful emotional triggers in human psychology. When someone feels curious, their mind opens a loop. It wants to understand. It wants to explore. It wants to come closer. And that's where attraction begins to grow. Not in certainty, but in intrigue. Let me share another example. Years ago, a client of mine, let's call him David, came to me frustrated. He was kind, respectful, well-spoken, and yet he constantly felt overlooked. He would compliment women in the most polite ways. "You look nice. You have a great smile. You seem really sweet." And while there's nothing wrong with those words, they didn't create any emotional impact. So we worked on shifting his approach, not to manipulate, but to express more honestly and more specifically what he was actually experiencing. One day, instead of saying, "You have a great smile," he said to a woman, "You smile like you already know something the rest of us don't, and I'm trying to figure out what that is." And do you know what happened? She paused. She laughed, but not in a dismissive way, in a curious way. She leaned in. The energy changed. That's the difference between a surface compliment and a psychologically engaging one. And I want you to notice something important here. This isn't about memorizing lines. It's about shifting awareness. It's about paying attention to subtleties, tone, energy, presence, the things most people overlook because they're too focused on saying the right thing. instead of expressing something real. Because at the end of the day, people don't connect with perfection. They connect with authenticity, with presence, with emotional truth. Now let's go a little deeper into something most people completely misunderstand: the difference between being liked and being remembered. You can be liked by being polite. You can be liked by being agreeable. You can be liked by saying the safe thing. But being remembered, that requires something else entirely. That requires emotional impact. Think about the people you remember most in your life. Were they the ones who said all the correct things? Or were they the ones who made you feel something unexpected, something different? That's what we're really talking about here. And as we move forward, I want you to start observing your own patterns, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Notice how often you default to safe language. Notice how often you hold back what you actually feel because you're trying to be appropriate or accepted. Because here's a gentle truth: when you filter yourself too much, you don't just remove risk, you remove impact. Now, let's explore the first major shift in how compliments actually work on a deeper psychological level. Most people compliment appearance because it feels easy, it feels obvious. But attraction is rarely built on the obvious. It's built on the subtle, the nuanced, the things that feel a little bit different. So instead of focusing only on how someone looks, begin to notice how they carry themselves, their energy, their presence, the way they interact with the world. For example, you might say, "You carry yourself like you don't need anyone's approval." That's rare. Now, what have you done here? You've moved beyond appearance into identity. And identity-level compliments are far more powerful because they touch how someone sees themselves. And this is where emotional connection begins to deepen. Because every human being, whether they admit it or not, wants to feel understood beyond the surface. They want to feel like someone sees the layers, not just the image they present to the world. Let me give you a small exercise you can try in your daily life. The next time you feel the urge to give a compliment, pause for just a moment. Ask yourself, what is it about this person that stands out beyond the obvious? Maybe it's their calmness. Maybe it's their confidence. Maybe it's the way they listen. And then express that simply, honestly, without overthinking. You might be surprised at how differently people respond. Now, there's another layer to this that's even more interesting, and that's the connection between the mind and the body when it comes to attraction. Most people separate the two. They either focus on physical attraction or intellectual admiration. But real chemistry often happens when both are engaged at the same time. For instance, saying something like, "You move like you're completely aware of the effect you have on people, and I'm trying not to get distracted by it." Notice what happens here. There's an acknowledgement of presence, combined with a subtle hint of impact. It engages both perception and feeling. And when those two align, the experience becomes much more memorable. But here's something I want to be very clear about. None of this works if it's forced. None of this works if it's coming from a place of trying to impress or trying to get a reaction. People are incredibly intuitive. They can feel intention beneath words. So if the intention is approval seeking, it weakens the message. But if the intention is simply expressing what you genuinely notice, it carries a completely different energy. And that energy is what people respond to. So let me ask you something gently. When was the last time you said something to someone that felt completely honest, even if it was a little unconventional? Something that wasn't rehearsed? Something that came from a real observation in the moment? If you can remember that moment, you'll probably also remember how it felt. There's a certain clarity in it, a certain groundedness, and that's the space where meaningful connection begins. As we continue, we're going to explore something even deeper: how the most powerful compliments often touch the parts of a person that are not usually acknowledged, the parts they don't openly show. And when you understand that, everything changes. Now let's move into something even more subtle and far more powerful than most people realize. Because up until now, we've been talking about moving beyond surface-level compliments. But the real shift happens when you begin to connect two dimensions at the same time: the mind and the body. You see, most people unknowingly separate these. They either say something purely physical or something purely intellectual. "You look amazing," or "You're really smart." Both are fine, but both are incomplete. And because they're incomplete, they don't create that deeper emotional resonance that leads to lasting attraction. What truly creates impact is when someone feels both understood and felt at the same time. Let me explain this in a way that's very real and relatable. Imagine someone notices not just how you look, but how you move, how you speak, how you pause, how you carry your energy. And then they express it in a way that makes you aware of yourself in a new light. That moment creates something very unique. It creates self-awareness combined with emotional stimulation. For example, instead of saying something direct and obvious, you might hear, "You have a way of speaking that makes people listen without realizing it." Now, what happens internally? There's a moment of reflection. Do I? And at the same time, there's a feeling, a quiet sense of being noticed in a deeper way. And that combination is incredibly powerful. There was a woman I once spoke with during a workshop. She shared something that stayed with me for years. She said, "I've had men compliment my looks my entire life, but I still remember the one who told me I had a calmness that made people feel safe. No one had ever said that to me before, and it changed how I saw myself." Think about that. One sentence, and it stayed with her for years. Not because it was dramatic, but because it touched something meaningful. That's the level we're aiming for. And I want you to start noticing this in your own interactions. How often do people respond more deeply when they feel understood rather than simply admired? Because admiration feels good, but understanding feels rare. Now let's take this a step further into something that requires a bit more awareness and a bit more emotional intelligence. Most people only compliment what is visible and socially acceptable. Kindness, beauty, positivity, confidence, and again, there's nothing wrong with that. But here's what often gets overlooked. Every human being has layers, not just the light, but also the parts they don't always show. The intensity, the edge, the contradictions, the depth. And when someone feels seen in those areas, it creates a very different kind of connection. For instance, instead of saying, "You're so nice," imagine hearing, "You seem kind, but I get the sense there's a strong edge to you that most people probably don't notice right away." Now pause and feel that difference. That's not just a compliment, that's recognition. And recognition, especially of something that isn't always visible, creates emotional impact. Because here's the truth. Most people spend a lot of their lives managing how they're perceived. They soften certain parts of themselves. They hide certain aspects. Not because those parts are wrong, but because they're not always accepted. So when someone comes along and sees those parts, without judgment, without fear, it creates a sense of relief, a sense of being allowed to be fully seen. And that's where connection becomes deeper, more real, more memorable. I remember a story from one of my viewers who once shared an experience from a simple dinner conversation. She said a man looked at her for a moment and said, "You seem very composed, but I don't think you're as calm as you appear." And she said it caught her off guard, not in a negative way, but in a way that made her feel understood. Because she wasn't calm, she was controlled. There's a difference, and he saw it. That moment stayed with her, not because it was flattering, but because it was accurate. And accuracy, especially when it touches something internal, creates a very strong impression. Now, I want to give you something practical here, something you can actually apply. The next time you're interacting with someone, instead of focusing on what sounds good, focus on what feels true. Observe small details, the way they react to things, the way they hold eye contact, the way they pause before speaking. And then, if something genuinely stands out, express it in a simple, grounded way. Not dramatically, not performatively, just honestly. Because honesty, when combined with awareness, becomes very compelling. Now let's explore another layer that's often misunderstood, and that's the difference between making someone feel desired and making someone feel seen. Desire is very common. It's expressed everywhere, directly, indirectly, constantly. And because of that, many people become desensitized to it. But being seen, truly seen, that's rare. When someone says something like, "I want you," it might create a reaction, but it doesn't necessarily create depth. It doesn't necessarily create curiosity or emotional connection. But when someone says something like, "You notice things most people miss, and I can tell you don't always talk about it," now something shifts. There's a sense of being understood on a deeper level, and that feeling tends to linger. Because human beings are not just looking to be admired, they're looking to be understood. There's actually research in psychology that supports this idea. Studies around emotional intelligence and interpersonal attraction show that people are more drawn to those who demonstrate accurate perception, meaning the ability to understand others beyond surface behavior. This is often referred to as empathic accuracy, and it plays a significant role in building meaningful connections. So when your words reflect that level of awareness, they naturally carry more weight. Now, I want to ask you something again, and I want you to really think about it. Have you ever had a moment where someone said something about you that felt almost too accurate? Something that made you pause and maybe even feel a little exposed, but in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, just real? If you've experienced that, then you already understand the power of what we're talking about. And if you haven't, then this is an opportunity to begin exploring that level of communication, not just in how you speak, but in how you observe. Because everything we're discussing here begins with attention, with presence, with actually noticing people instead of just reacting to them. And as you develop that awareness, your words naturally begin to change. They become more precise, more meaningful, more impactful. Now let's move into something even deeper, something that requires a bit more courage. And that is saying what most people don't say. You see, many interactions stay on the surface because people are afraid to go beyond it. They don't want to risk being misunderstood. They don't want to disrupt the comfort of politeness. But here's the paradox. When everything stays polite, everything also stays forgettable. The moments that stand out, the conversations that stay with us, are often the ones where something real was expressed, something slightly unexpected, something that broke the pattern. For example, instead of agreeing with everything someone says or responding in a predictable way, you might say something like, "You seem like someone who doesn't let people get too close easily." Not as an accusation, but as an observation. And in that moment, something shifts. The conversation moves from surface level exchange into something more personal. But again, this requires presence. It requires emotional intelligence. And most importantly, it requires sincerity. Because if it's forced, it doesn't land. But when it's real, it resonates. And that's what we're building here. Not just better words, but deeper awareness. Because once you understand how people actually experience connection, you don't need scripts. You don't need perfect lines. You simply need to pay attention and express what you genuinely see. And as we continue, we're going to explore how to use this awareness in a way that creates not just connection in the moment, but something that lingers even after the conversation ends. Something that stays in their mind, quietly, but powerfully. Now let's go even deeper into something that very few people truly understand, and that is this idea of emotional imprint. Because at the end of the day, attraction is not just about what happens in the moment. It's about what stays after the moment is gone. You can have a perfectly pleasant conversation with someone, polite, respectful, even enjoyable, and still be forgotten within hours. Not because anything went wrong, but because nothing truly marked the experience. And this is where most people miss the point. They focus so much on saying the right things that they forget to create a feeling that lingers. So the real question becomes, how do you create that kind of impact? How do you say something that stays in someone's mind, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was precise, unexpected, and emotionally relevant? The answer lies in something very simple, yet very rare, saying what most people hesitate to say, but doing it with calmness, awareness, and respect. Because there's a difference between being bold and being careless, and people can feel that difference immediately. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're in a conversation, and instead of staying in the safe zone, you say something like, "You seem very open when you talk, but I get the feeling there are parts of you don't let people see easily." Now notice, that's not an insult. It's not judgment. It's observation. But it touches something deeper. And when something touches depth, the mind doesn't dismiss it quickly. It holds onto it. It replays it. It tries to understand it. This is what we call a psychological hook. It's not about manipulation. It's about engaging the mind in a way that creates reflection. And reflection is what turns a simple interaction into a memorable one. There's actually a fascinating concept in psychology called the open loop effect. When something is left slightly unresolved, the brain continues to process it. It seeks closure. It keeps returning to the thought. So when you say something that is insightful, but not fully explained, it creates that loop. For example, instead of over-explaining or justifying your observation, you might simply say it, and then allow silence. Silence, when used with presence, is incredibly powerful. Most people rush to fill silence because they feel uncomfortable, but when you're comfortable in it, it communicates confidence, groundedness, and a certain kind of emotional stability that is very attractive. Let me share a real-world scenario that illustrates this beautifully. A woman once shared that during a conversation, a man said to her, "You're very good at keeping things light, but I don't think you're as simple as you pretend to be." And then he just paused. He didn't explain. He didn't justify. He simply held the space. She said that moment stayed with her for days. Not because it was overwhelming, but because it made her think. It made her feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. That's the kind of impact we're talking about. Now, I want to introduce you to another important shift, and that is moving from validation to selective validation. Most people give validation freely, constantly, without much thought, and because of that, it loses value. But when validation becomes selective, when it's given with intention, it carries much more weight. Think about it this way. If someone compliments you every few minutes, eventually it starts to feel automatic. It doesn't feel earned, it doesn't feel meaningful, but if someone observes quietly, listens carefully, and then offers one thoughtful, precise observation, it lands differently. It feels intentional, it feels real, and this ties into a deeper psychological principle: scarcity. When something is rare, it becomes more valuable, not because it's inherently better, but because it's not given away easily. And the same applies to your words. When you speak less, but say something meaningful, people listen more. When you don't rush to fill every space with compliments, the moments when you do speak stand out. Let me give you an example of how this might look in a natural interaction. You're having a conversation, you're listening, observing, not interrupting with constant praise. And then at a certain moment, you say, "The way you think about things, it's different. Not everyone would catch that." Now notice how simple that is. There's no exaggeration, no over-the-top language. But because it comes after a moment of observation, it feels grounded, and grounded words carry more impact than exaggerated ones. Now, let's move into something that requires a bit more courage, and that is introducing a slight challenge within your observation. This is where many people become uncomfortable, but it's also where attraction can deepen significantly, because when everything is agreeable, everything becomes predictable. And predictability over time reduces emotional engagement. But when there's a slight edge, a gentle challenge, it creates tension. Not negative tension, but engaging tension. For example, if someone says, "I don't let people get too close," instead of simply agreeing or praising that, you might respond with, "That sounds strong, but it also sounds a little lonely." Now again, this is not criticism, it's reflection. And reflection, when done with care, invites depth. It opens a door. Because you're not just accepting the surface statement, you're exploring what might exist beneath it. And that's what creates meaningful interaction. Let me share something important here. This kind of communication is not about trying to impress anyone. It's about being present enough to notice and grounded enough to express. And that requires self-awareness. Because if you're constantly seeking approval, you'll hesitate to say anything that might disrupt comfort. You'll stay safe. You'll stay agreeable. But when you're comfortable within yourself, you don't need every moment to be perfect. You allow space for real interaction, even if it's slightly uncertain. And that's where authenticity lives. Now, let's talk about something even more subtle. And that is creating curiosity that extends beyond the conversation itself. Because the strongest connections are not always the ones that feel complete. They're often the ones that feel slightly unfinished. When everything is explained, when everything is clear, the mind moves on quickly. But when something is left open, something is left unsaid, the mind continues to engage with it. For example, instead of revealing everything you're thinking, you might say, "There's something about you I haven't quite figured out yet." And then you leave it there. You don't rush to define it. You don't over-explain. You simply allow that thought to exist. And what happens? The other person begins to think about it. They become curious. They want to understand what you meant. That's not manipulation. That's human psychology. The mind is naturally drawn to incomplete patterns, and when used with sincerity, This creates a very natural form of engagement. Now, I want to pause for a moment and ask you something again. Have you ever left a conversation and found yourself thinking about something someone said hours later, maybe even days later? Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it felt meaningful and you couldn't quite let it go? That's the kind of impact we're talking about building. Not constant attention, but lasting presence. Because when someone continues to think about an interaction after it's over, that's where emotional connection begins to deepen. And as we move into the final part, we're going to bring all of this together in a very practical way. We're going to talk about how to balance presence, honesty, and emotional awareness so that your words don't just create a moment, but create something that stays, something that feels real, grounded, and quietly powerful. Now let's bring everything together, because what we've really been building here is not a set of clever lines, but a completely different way of seeing people and expressing what you see with clarity, calmness, and intention. Because the truth is, the most powerful compliments are not the ones that immediately satisfy. They're the ones that leave something unfinished, something that makes a person lean in emotionally and mentally. Most people think a compliment should give closure. It should make someone feel good instantly, wrap the moment up neatly, and move on. But the kind of connection that actually lingers doesn't come from closure. It comes from curiosity. It comes from that quiet moment where someone walks away thinking, why did that feel different? Let me explain this in a very real, grounded way. Imagine you're in a conversation, and instead of trying to impress, instead of trying to say something perfect, you simply observe and then say something like, I feel like there's a lot more to you than you let people see, and I'm not sure if that's intentional. And then you leave it there. You don't chase the reaction. You don't try to fix the silence. You allow it. That's where emotional tension is created, and tension, when it's grounded and respectful, is what keeps the mind engaged. Because here's something most people never realize. Attraction doesn't grow from constant reassurance. It grows from emotional movement, from moments that feel slightly uncertain, slightly different, slightly deeper than usual. Now, let's talk about one of the most important elements in all of this, and that is your presence. Because the words themselves, while important, are not the full picture. It's how they're delivered. It's the energy behind them. It's whether you're saying something to get a reaction or simply because it feels true to you in that moment. If your words come from a place of needing approval, they lose strength, even if the sentence sounds perfect. But if your words come from a place of calm certainty, they land differently. And people feel that instantly. There's a quiet confidence in someone who doesn't rush, who doesn't over-explain, who doesn't try to impress, but simply expresses. That kind of presence is rare, and rarity creates value. Let me share something practical you can begin applying immediately. The next time you're in a conversation, slow yourself down just a little. Instead of reacting quickly, take a moment to observe. Notice how the person speaks. Notice their tone. Notice their pauses. Notice what feels genuine and what feels rehearsed. And then, if something stands out, express it simply. You might say, you're very good at keeping things light, but I don't think that's the whole story. And then just pause. Let that be enough. Because often, the power is not in saying more, it's in saying just enough. Now, there's another layer I want you to understand, and this one is deeply important. It's the idea of emotional permission. Every person carries parts of themselves that they don't fully express, not because they're hiding something wrong, but because they're not sure how it will be received. It could be their intensity, their ambition, their vulnerability, their contradictions. And when someone feels that those parts are seen and accepted, something shifts internally. They relax, they open up, they feel safe, but also intrigued. For example, saying something like, you seem very composed, but I get the feeling you feel things more deeply than you show, can create that sense of permission. It tells the person, I see more than what's on the surface, and I'm not uncomfortable with it. And that creates connection, because connection is not built on perfection. It's built on acceptance of complexity. Now let's take this into something even more refined. The balance between saying enough and leaving space. Most people either say too much or too little. They either over-explain everything or they hold back completely. But the sweet spot, the place where connection really grows, is in between. You say something meaningful, and then you allow space for it to breathe. You don't rush to fill the silence. You don't chase validation. You trust the moment. Because when you trust the moment, the other person begins to feel it too. And that shared space, that quiet understanding, is where something real begins to form. Let me ask you something again, and I want you to answer it honestly to yourself. Have you ever met someone who didn't talk constantly, who didn't try to impress, but when they spoke, you listened, and afterward, you found yourself thinking about what they said? That's not an accident. That's presence. That's intention. That's someone who understands that words are not just sounds. They are experiences. And when you begin to approach communication in that way, everything changes. Now, before we close, I want to leave you with something very simple but very powerful. From this moment forward, stop trying to say what sounds good and start saying what feels true. Observe more. Speak less, but with meaning. Notice what others miss. And most importantly, allow your words to come from a place of calm awareness, not urgency. Because when you do that, you don't just become someone who gives compliments. You become someone who creates moments. Moments that people remember. Moments that stay with them. Moments that make them feel something real. And if this conversation made you pause, even for a second, if it made you think differently about the way you communicate, then take a moment to engage with it. Share your thoughts, reflect on your own experiences, and if you want to continue exploring these deeper aspects of human connection, make sure you stay connected here on Mindful Senior Living. Because this isn't just about attraction, it's about understanding people, including yourself, on a deeper, more meaningful level. And when you understand that, everything else begins to fall into place. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay present, stay grounded, and keep connecting from the heart. Goodbye.